How do you start a war? Easy, you fake the victims, you fake the headlines, then you blame the enemy you already wanted to fight. In 1962, the US military wrote a plan to do exactly that. Bombings, hijackings, and even staged funerals, all to start a war with Cuba. It was called Operation Northwoods, and the scary thing is, it almost happened. In 1959, a scrappy, bearded rebel named Fidel Castro marched into Havana and flipped an entire nation on its head. Just a few years earlier, he was a political prisoner. Now he was standing at the helm of Cuba, promising to kick out the elites, end American exploitation, and build a brand new Cuba for Cubans. For some, it sounded like revolution. For the United States, it sounded like trouble, knocking at the door. At first, the US didn't panic. They'd seen plenty of strongmen rise and fall in Latin America. But then Castro did something that made Washington sit up straight. He started nationalizing American-owned businesses. Sugar plantations, oil refineries, banks, and companies that had operated on Cuban soil for decades were being seized and absorbed into Castro's new government. Billions in American investments, wiped out practically overnight. Castro didn't stop there. He started cozying up to the Soviet Union. He shook hands with Khrushchev. He praised communism. He accepted Soviet weapons and advisors. Suddenly, this wasn't just about business anymore. This was Cold War level serious. A neighbour turns red. Now, before I go into Operation Northwood, I want you to understand the context of everything. I don't just want to throw data or facts at your face alone. I want to share the ideas, the thinking, the culture that birthed this unholy thing, so that you can understand and see the whole picture, not just pieces. So first, a history lesson. It was the perfect storm. On one side, America was already neck-deep in Cold War paranoia. The domino theory had taken hold. If one country fell to communism, others would follow. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about survival. The Red Scare had turned neighbour against neighbour. School children were practicing duck and cover drills, crouching under desks in case a nuclear bomb dropped from the sky. Communism was the enemy, and it was everywhere. Or at least that's how it felt. To Washington, this wasn't just a political shift. It was a humiliation, an ideological slap in the face. The CIA, furious at the speed of the collapse, scrambled for options. They couldn't believe they'd lost Cuba so easily. For decades, Cuba had been a playground for American business and tourism. Now it was waving a red flag. So, in early 1961, the CIA launched a plan that had been simmering for months. It was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. The idea was simple. Arm and train a group of Cuban exiles, send them back home, and let them spark a rebellion that would topple Castro from within. It was supposed to be clean, quiet, and deniable. It wasn't. The invasion was a disaster. The exiles landed on the beach and were immediately surrounded. Cuban forces responded faster and more effectively than anyone expected. The operation was exposed. The exiles were either killed or captured. And the whole world watched the United States get caught red-handed trying to overthrow another country's government. Worse still, Cuba began building even tighter ties with the Soviet Union. To Washington, it was like a slow-motion horror film. Castro had turned their backyard into Moscow's front porch, a launching pad for propaganda, possibly even missiles. Inside the Pentagon, frustration turned into obsession. The military and the CIA no longer saw Castro as just a threat. They saw him as a test of America's resolve, a test of whether the US could still protect its sphere of influence, a test of whether democracy could hold its own against communism. For the top brass in Washington, this wasn't just about a tropical island and a loud revolutionary anymore. This was about the entire global balance of power. If Castro could win in Cuba, what message did that send to countries in South America, in Africa, in Asia? If Cuba could resist, why not them? And that's when the tone inside US leadership began to shift. Quietly, behind closed doors. Enter General Lyman Lemnitzer. Lemnitzer wasn't a hot-headed radical. He was calm, polished, and by the book. He'd served through World War II, helped plan the Allied invasion of Europe, and was now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military position in the country. He was respected, trusted, and growing more frustrated by the day. To Lemnitzer and others on the Joint Chiefs, diplomacy wasn't working. The CIA's attempts to undermine Castro, sabotage, assassination attempts, all 634 of them, and economic pressure weren't getting results fast enough. The clock was ticking, and Cuba was becoming more entrenched. If the right strategy wasn't working, maybe it was time to consider the wrong one. A new mindset began to creep into military discussions, one that said maybe, just maybe, the American people needed a push. Maybe they needed to feel threatened. Maybe they needed a reason to demand action. If Castro wasn't enough of a villain on his own, perhaps he needed to be made one. No one said it publicly. But inside the Joint Chiefs, the seeds of a dangerous idea were being planted. If they couldn't remove Castro through back channels, maybe it was time to manufacture a reason. Something that would force the hand of the American people. And of the president himself. And that idea, it wouldn't stay in whispers for long. Because soon it would become a formal plan. Signed, stamped, and nearly put into motion. Northwoods is born. It was March 1962, just a few months after the Bay of Pigs embarrassment. Inside the Pentagon, behind heavy doors and soundproof walls, a group of military men gathered around a long table. These weren't low-level strategists or mid-tier officers. This was the top brass, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The room held the most powerful military figures in the United States. The mission was clear: find a way to justify a US military invasion of Cuba. No more subtle operations. No more waiting. They needed something bold, something with teeth, something that would give President Kennedy the cover he needed to say yes to force. And so they started drafting. The document they produced would carry a dry procedural title: Justification for US Military Intervention in Cuba. That name alone sounds routine, almost boring. But inside the pages laid out one of the darkest and most chilling proposals in American military history. The only feasible means of attaining this objective was through the use of force. The tone of the memo was dry, like it had been written by a lawyer in a hurry, but that made it more disturbing. There was no outrage, no emotion, no hesitation, just bullet points and logic. The kind of logic that only works if you forget you're dealing with real lives. They weren't talking about military strikes on Cuban soil. Not yet. First, they needed a reason, a spark, something that would provoke outrage from the American people and pressure the president to act. They weren't going to wait for a real attack. They were going to invent one. The document began listing possible scenarios, each one more calculated than the last. Point 2 of page 7 clearly states, a series of well-coordinated incidents will be planned to take place in and around Guantanamo to give a genuine appearance of being done by hostile Cuban forces. There was no emotional language in the memo, no warnings about potential casualties, no moral hand-wringing. Inside that room, they weren't trying to figure out whether they should manipulate the public. They were deciding how to do it best. The memo was thorough, detailed. It considered outcomes, media coverage, and international reaction. It even offered a historical precedent, suggesting the US could create a modern version of the Remember the Maine incident, a reference to the 1898 explosion that pushed the US into war with Spain. That tragedy had never been fully explained, but it had been incredibly effective at fueling national anger. The Northwoods plan took that idea and turned it into a strategy, and no one in that room tried to stop it. All 5 members of the Joint Chiefs signed the plan. The memo was forwarded to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. And from there, it would head to President Kennedy's desk. But long before that memo reached the Oval Office, the die had already been cast. The military had already shown what it was willing to consider. It wasn't a fluke, it wasn't a joke. It was a plan. At the top of the plan is a single mission: make it look like Cuba has attacked the United States, and don't wait for them to do it. Manufacture the entire thing. Frame it so clearly, so emotionally, that the American public has no choice but to support retaliation. Not think, just feel. Rage, grieve, demand war. And so they began laying out their playbook. The first concept was an aircraft shoot-down. The memo suggests loading a plane with what it calls selected passengers, who would be given fake identities and replaced with lookalikes or possibly dummies. The real plane would be switched out mid-flight with a drone, a remote-controlled aircraft. That drone would then be destroyed over Cuban waters. The explosion would be dramatic, the evidence staged, and the US would blame Cuba for killing innocent Americans. Page 10.a. An aircraft at Eglin AFB would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civil registered aircraft. At a designated time, the duplicate would be substituted for the actual civil aircraft and would be loaded with the selected passengers. It continues. The transmission will be interrupted by destruction of the aircraft, which will be triggered by radio signal. This would allow ICAO radio stations in the Western Hemisphere to tell the US what has happened to the aircraft, instead of the US trying to sell the incident. Page 10 to 11.b. They weren't even trying to hide how fake it was. The plan was to create an event convincing enough to let other countries report it back to the US as if it were real. Let the illusion grow organically. Next came the bombings. The memo suggests setting off explosions in cities like Miami and Washington. These wouldn't be symbolic stunts, they were expected to look real, with possible casualties. The perpetrators were supposed Cuban operatives, but of course the Cubans would be fake, either US agents posing as them or conveniently planted evidence pointing fingers. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. Page 8.4. The targets listed include nightclubs, stores, and public places. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. Page 9.4. Either way, the news would report that Cuban refugees, people fleeing Castro, had been attacked by his regime. The memo didn't stop at isolated incidents. It suggested a full narrative, linking multiple false events together to create what it called a helpful wave of indignation. From bombings to hijackings to funerals, they envisioned headlines, mourning families, flags at half-mast. It even included a suggestion to fake the death of a prominent Cuban exile, someone sympathetic and well-known within the US, and blame his murder on Cuban intelligence. In another section, the authors proposed hijackings, both real and simulated. They outlined how to hijack a commercial aircraft and have it rescued by Cuban defectors, creating a narrative that people within Cuba were resisting Castro and siding with America. This would show that even Cubans didn't support their leader. One proposal involved staging sabotage at the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. The plan was to make it look like Cuban forces had infiltrated and attacked a US military installation. They'd blow up equipment, start fires, and even stage funerals for fake victims. The memo even details how they'd manipulate the media. It suggests generating stories in newspapers and broadcasting witness testimony. They wanted full control of the story, start to finish. To tie it all together, the authors wrote, "A remember the main incident could be arranged in several forms." Page 8.3. That's a reference to the USS Maine, a battleship that exploded in Havana Harbour in 1898. That explosion, still debated today, led directly to the Spanish-American War. The Northwoods authors were saying, essentially, we can create our own Maine, we just need the right spark. The most disturbing part? There's no suggestion that any of this might be morally questionable. There's no paragraph about public trust, long-term damage, or blowback. There's certainly no caution about what happens if the public ever finds out. Everything about the memo screams perception over reality. The events themselves didn't need to be real, just believable. It didn't matter if the bomb was real, if the passengers were fake, or if the entire thing was an illusion. What mattered was the story, the image, the headlines, the outrage. That's what the planners were counting on. Not facts, not truth, just a reaction. Read plainly, the Northwoods memo is a how-to manual on fabricating consent. It's not about defending the country, it's about directing it. When you strip away the language, you're left with this. Make the American people believe Cuba attacked us. Do whatever it takes to sell that story. And then strike. Operation Mockingbird. If you still doubt this story is not real, or you think it was just a military drill that I exaggerated like Complan 8, 888, then let me bring your focus to one that was real and was not a military drill. Operation Mockingbird. If the military had the tools to stage events, the CIA had the power to shape the story. After all, planting explosives and faking aircraft crashes only gets you so far. The real magic, the part that turns noise into national outrage, happens in people's living rooms. On the front page, in the voice coming through the television set at dinner. That's where hearts change. That's where war begins. And the US government knew it. As early as the late 1940s, long before the Northwoods memo was ever typed, the CIA had been working behind the scenes to influence what Americans saw, heard, and believed. That program would eventually be known as Operation Mockingbird, and it didn't just flirt with propaganda, it embraced it. Mockingbird was about control, not just of foreign narratives, but domestic ones too. Its mission was to plant stories, shape public opinion, and steer media coverage in a direction that served US interests. And the way they did it was disturbingly simple. They bought influence. By the time the Cold War hit its boiling point in the early 1960s, Operation Mockingbird had burrowed deep into America's largest and most trusted media outlets. Time magazine, CBS News, the New York Times, all had journalists, editors, or executives with ties to the CIA. Some were on payroll, others were friendly collaborators. A few didn't even know they were being used. Through those connections, the CIA could feed stories, suggest headlines, and guide entire editorial directions without the public ever knowing. In some cases, reporters acted as assets abroad, gathering intel under the cover of journalism. In others, they were simply mouthpieces, passing along whatever the agency wanted printed, and they already had the infrastructure in place. The idea was simple. If you fake a Cuban terror attack in Miami, the footage better hit the evening news before the smoke clears. You don't let people sit in confusion. You give them the villain. You give them Castro's face on the screen. And you make sure no one asks too many questions. Mockingbird made that possible. The scary part is how little resistance this faced. In the atmosphere of the Cold War, patriotism blurred with obedience. If a journalist doubted a story, they risked being labelled un-American. Questioning the government's version of events wasn't seen as skeptical. It was seen as suspicious, even dangerous. And for the CIA, Mockingbird wasn't a side project. It was central. The agency understood that public opinion could make or break a foreign policy objective. It didn't matter how brilliant your plan was if the American people didn't buy it. So, they didn't leave that to chance. They wrote the story themselves. The question that should haunt us isn't whether they could have sold Northwoods to the public. It's how easily they probably could have. Let's say the fake hijacking happened. The drone explodes, and the news reports that 60 college students on a goodwill mission to Latin America were killed by Cuban missiles. Within hours, television anchors would be echoing the government's outrage. Editorials would call for swift action. Senators would stand on the floor of Congress and demand a response. And the public? They'd mourn. They'd rage. They'd want justice. Because that's what they were told to want. And if Mockingbird had already laid the groundwork, if reporters were already conditioned to trust anonymous sources and parrot agency narratives, then there wouldn't have been any resistance. The lie wouldn't just work, it would thrive. That's the danger. Not that the government had ideas like Northwoods, but that it had the means to make them stick. And they didn't need everyone in on it, just a few key players. Over the years, names have surfaced, journalists known to have worked with, or for the CIA, during the Mockingbird era. Joseph Alsop, a respected columnist. Ben Bradley, who would later become editor of the Washington Post. Alan Dulles, the CIA director before McCone, was reportedly fond of using press relationships as a tool of foreign and domestic influence. And that's just scratching the surface. We'll probably never know the full extent. Many records are sealed, others destroyed. But what's known is enough to paint a clear picture. The line between journalism and intelligence was never as solid as we were told. Mockingbird didn't just create lies from thin air. It framed truths. It shifted focus. It buried inconvenient details and amplified selected ones. In the case of Northwoods, it would have been the final piece of the puzzle, the bridge between a staged event and a furious, unquestioning public. The military knew how to stage the explosion. The CIA knew how to turn it into outrage. And the press, whether they knew it or not, was ready to carry the torch. And the scariest part is how quiet it all was. No announcements, no fingerprints. Just headlines, footage, quotes, and belief. Because once you control the story, you control the country. Luckily, one man said no. Kennedy says no. In March of 1962, the Northwoods memo finally made its way to President John F. Kennedy. A thick, dull-looking file filled with military jargon and cold, calculated proposals. Kennedy read it, and without hesitation he shut it down. He didn't revise it, he didn't ask for modifications, he didn't consult a panel or drag it through political channels. He said no, flat out. The kind of no that leaves no room for negotiation. To understand how big of a move that was, you have to understand the pressure Kennedy was under. This was a young president in the middle of the Cold War. Just a year earlier, the Bay of Pigs invasion had collapsed under his watch. The military had expected full backing, and when JFK didn't deliver enough air support, the whole mission fell apart. Castro remained in power, the CIA looked incompetent, and Kennedy was left carrying the blame. The Pentagon wasn't just frustrated, they were losing faith in him, and Kennedy knew it. So when the Joint Chiefs, led by General Lyman Lemnitzer, handed him the Northwoods proposal, they expected cooperation. They expected a course correction after the Bay of Pigs mess. What they got instead was the opposite. Kennedy saw the plan for what it was, a line that should never be crossed. Using American lives as props in a geopolitical theatre, faking attacks to trigger war. No matter how desperate the Cold War felt, that wasn't the answer. Kennedy's rejection of Northwoods wasn't just a policy decision, it was a statement, a boundary, and it sent ripples through the halls of the Pentagon. At the time, the military had been quietly building momentum behind the scenes. There was a growing sense that the White House was too cautious, too reluctant to act. The Joint Chiefs believed the situation in Cuba required decisive, aggressive action. Lemnitzer in particular had grown impatient with Kennedy's resistance to force. But once the president dismissed Northwoods, the message was clear. He wasn't going to be bullied into war, and he wasn't going to manufacture a tragedy just to justify it. That decision didn't come without consequences. Later that year, General Lemnitzer was removed from his post as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There was no scandal, no headlines, no official reason blasted across the airwaves. He was simply reassigned, moved over to NATO, quietly and cleanly. On paper, it was a routine transition. Behind the scenes, it looked like a demotion dressed as a promotion. The Northwoods plan was shelved, locked away, buried. But the tension didn't die with it. Kennedy's decision marked a deepening divide between the president and the military establishment. And things weren't much better with the CIA. After the Bay of Pigs, JFK had already started questioning the agency's role and its accountability. The more he learned, the more alarmed he became about how much power the intelligence community held, often without real oversight. In a private moment, he reportedly said, "I want to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds." That's not a casual critique. That's the kind of statement that makes enemies. And Kennedy wasn't just talking. He started pushing for real change. He restructured the CIA's leadership. He tried to reel in military control. He leaned more heavily on diplomacy, even when the generals were demanding confrontation. Most famously during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, just months after Northwoods, Kennedy refused to invade Cuba, even when some military advisors insisted it was the only option. That restraint may have prevented World War III. But to those in the Pentagon who believed strength came from force, not negotiation, Kennedy's choices looked weak, software dangerous. So you have to wonder, was rejecting Northwoods just another item on the growing list of grievances held by people who believed JFK was standing in the way of America's dominance? The memo didn't get leaked. No public backlash came. But behind the scenes, the rejection echoed. It marked Kennedy not just as a cautious leader, but as someone willing to stand alone. Someone willing to say no, even when all the powerful voices in the room were saying yes. That kind of leadership wins respect from some, but it also paints a target. Northwoods never happened, but its existence proved that the government was willing to plan the unthinkable. And the man who stopped it, who saw through the illusion, the manipulations, the moral rot, was the same man who would be shot dead in broad daylight less than 2 years later. It would be reckless to draw a direct line between rejecting Northwoods and Kennedy's assassination, but it would also be naive to ignore the pattern. This was a president who pushed back on the CIA, who clashed with the military, who blocked invasions, resisted false flags, and demanded control over agencies that were used to operating in the shadows. He said no to their plans, again and again. And then one day in Dallas, everything stopped. Was it the right moral call? Absolutely. Kennedy drew a line that most men in power would have blurred. He refused to let fear dictate ethics. He chose truth over convenience. But was that decision also a risk, maybe the biggest one of his life? We may never know. What we do know is this: the man who stopped Operation Northwoods never got the chance to finish the job. And the country he left behind would spend decades trying to figure out what exactly had been going on behind the curtain all along. What if Operation Northwood had been approved? This isn't some wild fantasy. We've seen pieces of it before. In August 1964, just 2 years after Operation Northwoods was rejected, the United States announced that one of its Navy destroyers, the USS Maddox, had been attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. It was a bold, serious claim. Shots fired at a US warship in international waters. That was no small incident. The American public barely had time to process it before President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed the nation, sounding calm but urgent. He told Americans that this aggression couldn't go unanswered. Congress moved fast. Within days, they passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, essentially giving the president the green light to take military action in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. It was sweeping, broad. It gave Johnson a blank check to escalate the conflict as he saw fit. And he did. Soon after, American troops were flooding into Southeast Asia. What had started as a small advisory mission ballooned into a full-scale war. Over the next decade, more than 58,000 American soldiers would die in Vietnam. So would millions of Vietnamese civilians. But here's where things get disturbing. Years later, once the war had dragged on and public trust had begun to crumble, details emerged that shook the foundation of that 1964 claim. It turned out that the second attack, the one that had supposedly confirmed North Vietnam's hostility and justified Johnson's swift action, very likely never happened. The first incident between the USS Maddox and North Vietnamese boats on August 2nd did take place, though even that had more complexity than was first admitted. But the supposed second attack on August 4th, the one that triggered the war, there was no enemy gunfire, no clear radar contact, no damage. Even crew members on the ship reported confusion. Some thought they were firing at shadows. Others saw nothing at all. Eventually, declassified documents and internal government communications confirmed the truth. The second attack was, at best, a mistake. At worst, it was a fabrication. The Johnson administration had exaggerated, or invented, what happened to rally support for military escalation. And the plan worked. The American people rallied. Congress rolled over. The press echoed the official story. And a long, bloody war began. When you read the Northwoods memo today, knowing what we now know about the Gulf of Tonkin, it's impossible not to connect the dots. Northwoods laid out a blueprint. Create a crisis. Make it look like America had been attacked. Control the narrative. Then strike hard and fast while the country is still in shock. Swap out Cuba for Vietnam, and it's the same strategy. A false crisis leads to real war. Back in 1962, the military couldn't get Kennedy to approve Northwoods. But in 1964, the Johnson administration didn't need such elaborate staging. All it took was a confusing night in the Gulf and a confident press release. The pattern becomes clearer the more you look at it. This cycle repeated in Vietnam, and it cost countless lives. But the terrifying part isn't just that the government made a mistake, it's that the script had already been written 2 years earlier. Northwoods proved that some officials were willing to plan exactly this kind of scenario. All they needed was a target and an excuse. The USS Maddox incident gave them both. You might think, well, governments make mistakes in wartime. It's complicated. Sure, but that explanation starts to crumble when you realise how fast the decision to escalate was made. There was no pause, no confirmation. Just immediate action because that was the plan all along. Johnson needed a reason. The military wanted a war. And once the Maddox fired its warning shots, real or imagined, they got both. The deeper tragedy is that most Americans had no idea. For years, people trusted what they saw on TV and read in the papers. It wasn't until years later, after thousands of body bags had come home, that people started asking questions. And by then the damage was done. Northwoods was shelved, never executed. But it survived in spirit. It showed how easy it is to push a nation into war, not through attack, but through belief. If people think they've been attacked, they'll demand justice. If the enemy seems vicious and real, people will rally without hesitation. And once the truth comes out, if it ever does, it's too late. If that's not enough to convince you, this is another example. On June 8, 1967, in the middle of the Six-Day War between Israel and several Arab nations, a US Navy intelligence ship, the USS Liberty, was stationed in international waters off the coast of Egypt. It was a clear day. The ship was marked, flying an American flag, and operating well outside any combat zone. By all accounts, it was doing nothing aggressive. But that didn't stop what came next. Israeli forces attacked the Liberty. Jets dropped napalm and rockets. Torpedo boats followed. 34 Americans were killed. More than 170 were wounded. The assault lasted over an hour. Israel claimed it was a tragic mistake, a misidentification. They said they thought the Liberty was an Egyptian vessel. They apologised, paid reparations. The US government accepted it. Case closed. Except for the survivors, it wasn't that simple. Crew members have spent decades insisting the ship was clearly marked, that the American flag was visible, that the Israeli pilots knew exactly who they were targeting. Some survivors even claim their communications were jammed, their lifeboats strafed. They don't call it an accident, they call it a cover-up. And this is where Northwoods echoes in the background. Because once you know the government once considered staging attacks on Americans to justify war, your view of history changes. Events that once looked like blunders or fog of war moments now feel planned, at least possible. The Liberty incident may not have been a false flag, but the questions around it haven't gone away, especially not for those who lived through it. They saw their government back down from a real investigation, accept Israel's apology, and move on. No trials, no outrage, no closure. To them, it looked like politics won over truth, and once again, trust took the hit. Then fast forward to 2001. September 11th starts as a normal Tuesday, clear skies, morning rush. And then the world changes. 2 planes crashed into the Twin Towers. Another hits the Pentagon. A 4th goes down in Pennsylvania. America is under attack. The nation unites in grief and fury. Flags go up. Congress convenes. Speeches echo through television sets. And within weeks, US troops are heading to Afghanistan. Then Iraq. The war on terror begins. In the middle of this chaos, another thing happens. Very quietly, very quickly. The Patriot Act passes. Just 45 days after the attacks, a 342-page law is signed into existence, giving the US government unprecedented surveillance powers, wiretapping, data collection, detention without trial, all in the name of national security. Most people don't even read the fine print. They're still grieving, still afraid. And the government once again moves fast before anyone can stop and ask questions. This is where Northwoods steps out of the shadows. Because while no one is saying 9/11 was staged, not in this script, not with proof, the idea that it could be doesn't sound like a wild conspiracy anymore. Not after Northwoods. That's the damage the 1962 memo caused, not just what it proposed, but what it proved. That there were once people in power who thought it was acceptable to kill Americans, fake disasters, and lie to the public if it helped justify a war. Even if that plan was stopped, the fact that it ever existed changes everything. It plants a seed of doubt. So when September 11th happened, that seed grew. Suddenly, millions of Americans started asking uncomfortable questions. Could parts of it have been allowed to happen? Could someone have ignored warnings? Could a tragedy that real, that raw, have been exploited or even engineered for political gain? Most of these questions were brushed aside. Conspiracy theorists were ridiculed. But behind the shouting, the core suspicion stayed. Not because of imagination, but because of history. Because now there was a precedent. Now, this is the part of the video where I'd say, this isn't true. Or it was, but exaggerated. Show you what critics say about this, pointing out how it will never happen. But with this story, there's no such thing as that. We have enough receipts to show that this is a normal thing for the American government. What is even more worrying is how the public found out about Operation Northwood. Operation Northwood sat in a sealed folder, locked behind layers of government secrecy, away from reporters, historians, and the public. It wasn't leaked. It wasn't whispered about in Congress, it just disappeared. Until 1997. That year, something else was happening. The US government had created a body called the Assassination Records Review Board, ARRB, a panel with the sole purpose of reviewing and releasing files related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. After years of speculation, public demand and mounting pressure, there was finally a coordinated effort to pull back the curtain and let the public see what had been hidden since 1963. As the ARRB dug through thousands of documents, memos, transcripts, letters and reports, they found something they weren't expecting. Operation Northwoods. It wasn't buried inside a Kennedy assassination theory. It wasn't even directly connected to the murder. But because it had been part of the larger web of Cold War planning and intelligence activities surrounding Cuba, it ended up in the stack. And just like that, one of the most disturbing memos in American history surfaced. No leak, no whistleblower. Just a quiet, bureaucratic release. Or should I even say, a mistake? If not for that mistake, we might have never known about this. Which begs the question, how many other documents, proposals, or entire operations are still locked in cabinets? Not because they're being protected from public harm, but because no one has asked the right question yet. How many files were marked discarded but never shredded? How many memos were stamped top secret and never revisited? That's what makes this story more than just a historical curiosity. It's a warning about how government information is managed, about how easy it is for actions to vanish into the folds of classified records. Most Americans believe in a basic level of transparency, that if something major happens, the truth will come out eventually, that the system works, that we'll get the facts. But Northwoods challenges that belief, because this wasn't a rogue idea scribbled on a napkin. It wasn't speculation. It was formal, and it stayed hidden for 35 years. 35 years where journalists could have exposed it. 35 years where politicians could have debated it. 35 years where citizens could have questioned the people they were told to trust. But instead we got silence. And when it finally did surface, there was no investigation, no accountability, no reckoning. Just a strange, haunting footnote in the middle of a file dump. And that's the final twist. Northwoods didn't get buried once. It got buried twice. First by secrecy, then by apathy. We talk a lot about what makes a nation strong: military power, economic dominance, technological superiority, but strength also comes from truth, from trust, from a shared belief that, at the very least, those in charge won't stage your death to push a war. And maybe that's the scariest part, because if something this dangerous, this outrageous, this real, can disappear so easily, then what else might be hiding just a few folders away?